Welcome back to this explainer. Now, in our ongoing exploration of absolute truth, a really critical and honestly somewhat uncomfortable question inevitably pops up. What is the actual, tangible evidence that someone has truly grasped this truth? Historically, it's super easy for us to confuse intellectual accumulation with spiritual maturity, right? We memorize the text, we debate the theology, and we build up these robust philosophical frameworks. But the biblical narrative insists that the answer isn't found in a catalog of ideas in our heads. It's found in practical, visible fruit. So today we're going to explore the concept of a dead faith, stepping entirely out of the realm of abstract ideas and directly onto the battlefield of action. Let's dive in. To kick things off, picture this. A 17-year-old student walks up to his pastor and asks an incredibly perceptive question. He says, if salvation is not by works, why does James write that faith without works is dead? This isn't just some fleeting curiosity from a teenager. It's actually the central theological tension of our spiritual lives. It's the defining paradox that determines whether a community is actively breathing or simply occupying space in a building. So, let's start by laying down the foundation of truth to make sense of this. There has always been this fine line between the dogmatic theology we study and the practical reality we're meant to live out. We often see two of the most foundational teachings in the New Testament placed side by side, and at first glance they can seem totally at odds. On one hand, we have the Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians, framing salvation entirely as a sovereign, legal act of grace. Paul was writing to folks who were tempted by legalism, this toxic idea that you could somehow buy God's favor with your own sweat and moral perfection. He shuts that down completely. But on the other hand, we have the book of James, which argues passionately that saving faith is literally genetically programmed to bear fruit. You see, James was fighting a totally different enemy, cheap grace, the idea that belief requires absolutely no change in your behavior. These two writers aren't fighting each other at all. They are fighting two different extremes. Paul is explaining how we are saved from death, while James is illustrating what a resurrected person actually looks like walking around in the world. And that brings us to a brilliant quote that synthesizes this whole tension beautifully. Faith justifies the believer before the throne of God, works testify to that justification before the eyes of men. It is honestly that simple and yet so incredibly easy to misunderstand. A huge mistake in modern faith communities is confusing the root with the fruit. We confuse the original cause of salvation, which is pure, unmerited grace, with the inevitable biological evidence of that salvation, which is active service and love for others. Which brings us to the ultimate dilemma, faith or works. James is incredibly direct about resolving this dilemma. Honestly, he's almost blunt. He points out a rather terrifying reality. Merely possessing theological information is completely useless on its own. He argues that even demons possess the correct orthodox information. They are perfectly aware that God exists, they completely understand his power, and they even shudder in fear because of it. Yet they are fundamentally in rebellion. Having the correct doctrine in your head without any practical, sacrificial service to your neighbor, that doesn't make someone a mature believer. It simply makes them a spectator with a highly developed vocabulary. Now, let's shift gears and look at the actual math of the modern church. When we step out of ancient theology and into modern sociological statistics, the math reveals a tremendous amount about the current health of our communities. We see a spiritual subversion of a very famous economic model, the Pareto Principle, or the 80-20 rule. Applied to modern church dynamics, we find that a staggering 80% of people operate purely as consumers, that are passive spectators who just show up to receive, sit, and consume an experience. The remaining 20%? They are the producers. These are the active participants who carry literally the entire organizational and spiritual weight of the house. We have an overwhelming majority relying completely on an exhausted minority. Let's slow down and really look at the gravity of these numbers from recent community surveys, because they're a bit of a reality check. Only 15 to 24% of people are weekly volunteers. Less than 30% will volunteer even once over the course of an entire year. And perhaps most revealing of all, only a tiny fraction, just 5 to 8%, are willing to open their homes and take on the responsibility of leading a small group. When we translate this cold mathematical reality back into our spiritual context, we have to admit a difficult truth. We aren't looking at an exclusive, high-achieving club here. We're looking at a severely imbalanced, deeply unwell organism. And that imbalance leads us to look at the anatomy of what is essentially a spiritual corpse. This anatomical issue brings us directly to the profound Greek concept of pneuma. Pneuma literally translates to the breath of life, the vital principle that animates a living, breathing body. James argues that just as a physical body without pneuma is a corpse, A faith without action is equally dead. An artificial, consumer-driven faith might have all the correct external anatomy. It attends the gatherings, it raises its hands, it sings all the culturally appropriate songs. But without service, it fundamentally lacks the breath of life. It functions as a theological corpse, consuming oxygen and resources within the community, but offering zero vital utility to the organism as a whole. The logical conclusion here is quite paradigm shifting. Listen to this. Volunteering within a community is not a polite favor that you do for the organizational leadership just to help keep the lights on. It is the biological evidence that your own faith still breathes. Moving from the passive audience to the active battlefield of service is the primary marker of spiritual maturity. Mature participants don't gather to consume a spectacle, they gather to carry the shared responsibility of their community. And the amazing thing is, this kind of service actually transforms families. So what happens when that dead faith is actually activated? The sociological data gives way to deeply human, beautiful narratives. Consider this documented case of a household that was totally divided by faith. A wife, wanting to root her family and community, didn't start by preaching at her deeply skeptical husband. She simply started serving. She organically volunteered in the children's ministry, and as a direct result of her quiet, consistent service, her children became deeply engaged. Well, this positive shift in the home eventually piqued the husband's curiosity enough that he finally attended a gathering. That one initial exposure completely shifted the trajectory of his life. He found faith, the family was baptized together, and ultimately, that very home, which was once completely devoid of spiritual engagement, was opened up to host a small group. Friends and neighbors began finding community right there in their living room. An entire generational line was altered, not through some masterful theological debate, but because one person decided to stop consuming and start serving. So, how do we practically activate our faith? Well, this is exactly what a living faith does. It refuses to be contained. The ultimate instruction on this comes directly from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus tells his followers to let their light shine before men, so that others may see their good works and glorify the Father. Notice the order of operations here. It's crucial. You don't perform good works to generate the light or to earn your salvation. No, you serve because the light has already entered you, and by its very nature, it illuminates everything around you through practical, tangible attitudes. When this happens, your workplace changes, your family dynamic shifts, and your actions don't point back to your own moral superiority. They point directly to a much greater design. The invitation for us today is to thoroughly examine the foundation of our own lives. It's a call to step out of a dormant spectator mindset and into a vibrant, breathing existence where theology actually meets the pavement. The profound question we're left with isn't about what we claim to believe, but what those beliefs compel us to do. So I want to pose a challenge to you. How will you activate your faith through service this week? What tangible, practical step will you take today to prove that your faith still breathes? Let us know your plans down in the comments. We would love to see how you are stepping out. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and we will see you next time.